They thought he was crazy to rebuild that old church. His father was furious about it. He thought his son had lost it. Even the priest assigned to look after the worn-out old place didn't know what to make of this carousing and rather privileged brat offering him money, talking about fixing it up. Yet he was persistent, even if a little strange. This young man named Francis. As his biographer Thomas later recorded, he had seen a vision. Jesus had spoken to him through the painted cross in the church. He heard the words, "Francis, repair my house." And so he was put on a mission. There was a divine reason behind it all, supposedly, behind his stubborn holiness, rebuilding that old church. But St. Francis was no different, really, than other holy and wholly stubborn men and women, impassioned and driven by faith and vision. People like Abraham, who was a father and a pilgrim. People like David, who danced and dreamed in front of the Ark of the Covenant, this king. And Solomon, the builder of the temple. They were all stubborn, visionary souls. Given jobs to do by God himself, they were obedient and maddeningly focused on what God wanted them to do. It is in the history of holy things and holy people a recurring theme, persistence, a holy persistence. And what motivated these holy and strong ancestors of ours wasn't merely a miraculous vision or a nationalistic spirit or anything like that, but something else, something deeper, something more divine, some personal command from some higher authority, a power that made them powerful, empowering them to do what they were called to do, no matter the challenges and no matter the obstacles. But what was it, this power? In today's gospel, we hear Jesus say, "Let not your hearts be troubled." And we may imagine, as we sometimes do when we read this particular text, we may imagine that Jesus said these words in sort of the gentlest, caring, pastoral tones, full of warm and comforting sentiment, let not your hearts be troubled. But that's not actually the case. The context is dark and dangerous. Judas had just left their company to do what he was going to do, and disciples, they were clueless and fearful. But Jesus, he doesn't coddle the disciples here. He's not gentle here. If you read the original Greek, the mood in Jesus is blunt and explicitly slow. And it's imperative. He's not saying, "Let not your hearts be troubled." He's saying, "Do not be afraid." Do not be afraid, he says. Believe, I am coming back. And Jesus means what he says. He's a man of his word because he is, as he has said again and again in the Gospel of John, he is the Son of the Father. Because he said so divinely and scandalously, "I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. I and the Father are one," he said. This is what Philip was so slow to understand. Be not afraid is a commandment, not a suggestion. It's It's a command given by the Lord and Master of all things, a command given by Christ, who made the darkest darkness bright with sacrifice and resurrection, the Christ that can make your darkness bright, no matter how dark your world or our world has become. Let not your hearts be troubled, Jesus says. Our God is strong, and you'd better believe it. It's a command. Now, what does this mean for us? In St. Francis's day, rebuilding that rundown old church was a sign of what Francis and his brothers would do for the whole church, renewing her spirit in the spirit of simplicity and powerful preaching, revitalizing a church and a society which had become weighed down by a feudal and cultural lethargy. Pope Innocent III, the Pope in Francis's day, he saw St. Francis in his dreams holding up the crumbling edifice at the Lateran Basilica. Francis's mission was greater than rebuilding that one little church, which you can still visit today. So what's the message for us? What's the point? It is possible, without giving in to too much of a gloomy point of view, to suggest that our society in some ways has grown darker, more hostile, more fearful, more violent, less understanding, and less compassionate. Things related to faith, for instance, ideas or ethical convictions, even just plain sincerity, are often subject to ridicule in a manner noticeably more caustic than in the past. You need only spend about a minute and a half on Twitter to discover that. For people of faith, there are enemies. Our enemy is nothing other than faith itself. Sam Harris said, this rather silly and not too intelligent atheist crusader. Wrote that very confidently in a best-selling book. Add to this, aside from faith, especially pronounced in these strange pandemic days, ours has become a world dangerously politicized. What the historian Richard Hofstadter, a rather famous American historian, he wrote a half-century ago, he called it the paranoid style. It seemingly consumed now both the right and the left, not only in politics, but in society itself. The paranoid style, it's a haunting phrase. We need only witness what's going on. The divisions breaking out all over the country, divisions of various kinds, all of them divisions of trust. That, for me, is what's so unnerving, that ours is a society in which trust has broken. We were already in a new and not altogether wholesome age, and now we're scared of each other. And nobody has any idea what's next. But Jesus still says, "Let not your hearts be troubled." He still commands us to believe and to be not afraid. He said this to the disciples in the darkness, and he says the same to us in ours. And so for those of us who really believe, this should be an exhilarating age, strangely. An age in which we look for the work of the Spirit because we know the Spirit's at work. By way of example, it's part of my story coming into the Catholic Church, the many details of which I don't have time to share, nor would you be interested. Years ago, when I was working with several other Anglican ministers, I was an Episcopal priest at the time, we were working with the then Catholic Bishop of Fort Worth, Bishop Van, who's now in California. We were trying to get as many of our people as possible to come home to the Catholic Church, and we were working with the local Catholic bishop and the Vatican at the time through him. Very interesting time of all sorts of strange meetings. Once, at a meeting we had with the bishop, he had just gotten off the phone with Rome, with the prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith at the time, who himself had just come from a meeting with Pope Benedict. And he told us that Pope Benedict, this would have been just a few minutes before our meeting began, that Pope Benedict, when reviewing our particular situation there in Fort Worth, Pope Benedict made the comment to the prefect as he was walking out the door. He said, "The Spirit is blowing uniquely in the state of Texas. The Spirit is blowing uniquely in the state of Texas." A throwaway comment, perhaps, about us, about you and me. And still, it hit me. It still does. The Spirit is blowing uniquely in the state of Texas. Why would the Pope ever say that? What did he mean? I think I know what he means. But at the time, however, I was one scared Episcopal priest, and I was unsure whether or not I'd get fired and lose everything, and it was a nervous time. But the Pope seemed to see it differently. The bishops around me at the time seemed to see it differently. The Spirit is blowing uniquely in the state of Texas. It gives me goosebumps to think of it still, to think of the Spirit at work, even though I was so afraid. And so here at St. Rita, what are we doing? We've been building for years, spiritually and materially, just like St. Francis and so many bold believers like him. It's what the church has always kind of been doing. The first reading from Acts of the Apostles, they were in intense persecution, and what did the apostles do? They said, well, we need some deacons, you know. They weren't thinking about cowering, they were thinking about building. Some think the age of faith is over. There are even some Catholics, you know, they're worn and worried by the harassing powers of our present culture, by pandemic, and wondering where on earth normal went. But what should we do? What does faith and hope look like in a world like ours? It looks, I think, like what so many of us are already doing. Not the people who are talking and tweeting about it so much, just the people that are actually doing it. Working, giving, praying, helping one another fearlessly. Think about what these strange pandemic days mean spiritually. But don't waste time with paranoia. Don't look for conspiracies or theories. That's not what I mean at all. Rather, look for light in the darkness. Think about what it means to love your neighbor in the time of the coronavirus and when the Lord still says, don't be afraid. So what's your job? What's my job? It's this. Do your part. Don't be a bump on a log. Don't cower in fear, but instead hear what Jesus is saying to us, what he's always said to his disciples in every age. Get up. Do good in my name. Laugh at the doomsayers. Providence is at your back. I am the Lord, and you need to remember that always. Friends, these are very interesting times, but we've been commanded to be courageous. If you read the book of Revelation, for example, one thing Christians are called in that book is conquerors. So don't waste your time nursing fear and resentment, but rather be faithful. Be a fearless follower of Jesus. And never forget to stand downwind of the Spirit. The Spirit is blowing uniquely through us. Amen.